Hello and welcome back. We're continuing our discussion around the object basics and creating objects, what objects have in them, how we actually implement all this code, by now discussing this idea of constructors. So let's just take a second and imagine if you were going to buy like a cell phone, but you had to build it yourself and install everything yourself and move everything over yourself. Nowadays, when you buy a new cell phone, they basically just take all your old stuff and put it on your phone, which is obviously very nice. They just sort of copy it all in. But back back in the old days, right, you would have to basically assemble your phone. You would have to put every single little, piece on and move all of your like all of your settings over. And I mean, we didn't have to like actually build it ourselves, of course, but I mean, we can sort of imagine the difference between ready to use furniture and, building the furniture yourself, and how much more tedious one is over the other. That's basically what we're discussing here. So in the last video, we had made a class. I'm just going to rewrite some of this code out here for us. A class book. And just for shorthand here, we'll do a string title and author. And we'll do an int number of pages. I'll just call it pages. And then there would be more here that we'll fill out later. And then as a reminder, this lives in book.java. Okay. And then we also had our main over in a different file. Public class main, public static void main, as I do my shorthand, string args. All right. And what we discussed was this idea that if we wanted to make a bunch of books, book one, we would write it like this, new book, and then we would say b1.title, and we'd have the title of the book, title one. And we could write an author, author one. And we could do a number of pages of 100. And if we wanted to make a second book, we would have to pick up all of these lines, put them right here, and just change this information, right? B2, 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 and change the title here, change all this information. Title 2, author 2, and pages, I don't know, 50. And for every book that we wanted to create, we actually ended up having to write 4 lines of code, right? So 4 lines of code per book. 4 lines per book. Now, this is going to get really messy really quickly. And so what we're actually going to be able to do is implement this new idea of constructors. And constructors will help us construct our objects. Now, we actually already have been using a constructor, which is right here. This is known as the default constructor. And it's just the name of the class with empty brackets. And that's all it is. That's our default constructor. Now, by default, you get a default constructor, meaning, and I better put this down actually in a comment so that we don't forget. Whoops. If no constructor defined, we get the default. So if you don't make your own constructor, you automatically have access to this default, which is why I have nothing written here. I've never written a constructor. I've always been able to just say new book with empty brackets. Now, I can also make my own constructor. In fact, I can make a default constructor over here. I can say public book, and I can define some default values. Default author, default, and pages 0. So in a previous video, I had mentioned that if you didn't set one of these strings, you would get the default value for it, which actually was going to be null. So if you had printed a book with no title yet set, you would have gotten null for that title. And if you would have tried to print a book with the author not set yet, you would have gotten null. Now, if none of this code existed, so let's just do a new book over here. Book B3 equals new book. And I try to print out some of this book, b3.title. So this code right here, what am I going to get? Well, the b3 title, I'm actually going to get default. Because now when I say new book, it's going to call into my constructor over here. And it will automatically preset those instance values. Now you'll notice that my constructor has no return type and no static, and that is on purpose. So we absolutely need to make sure we understand that a constructor looks a little bit different than a method. It can still be public or private, and again, we'll do access modifiers later, but the big takeaway point here is that there's no static and there's no return type ever. All right. Now this is our default constructor. Previously we had a default constructor that basically gave us the default primitive values and string values without us having to define anything. As soon as we define any version of constructor, I'm going to show you another version in a minute, but as soon as we define any version of a constructor, what we find is that we no longer can rely on the default. We have to write one. So right now I've defined this default. This is what will always run. So right now that makes sense and that's fine. However, we also can pass information in at creation. So let's add another type of constructor here. Let's add a public book constructor where we pass in our string title, our string author, and our int page count. And then we can set our values in here to title. I probably should have done this one in blue so that it matched this code there. Whatever. Title T, author A, and pages P. And so now if we go back over to main, let me extend this a little, and we say book B4 equals a new book. In these brackets, we can actually put title 4, comma, author, comma, 57 page count. And now when we actually call book B4 new book, this new book will try and find a constructor that has a string, and an int. It will find it right here, string, and int. It works just like a method would. So it finds it, it passes in these three pieces of information into T, A, and P, and then it sets them in title, author, and pages. So here's another way of defining a constructor. And now, rather than this being 4 lines of code, we have turned our creation of book objects into a single line of code with its data internally. So we don't have to just rely on default values. Now it is worth noting that as soon as you make a constructor, even one like this that has parameters, you lose access to the Java built-in default. So what that means is if I instead didn't write this constructor and had code that looked like this, my code would not run. Because I have this constructor, so this works, but I cannot rely on the Java default constructor anymore because I have a constructor defined. It worked the other way. When this did not exist, I was able to rely on default. But as soon as something exists, I cannot rely on default anymore. So if I want to be able to use both a default version and a parameterized version, I need to actually have 2 constructors, one with 0 arguments, 0 parameters, and one with the parameters I want. Now in 10.10, you would have learned about method overloading, and we'll talk more about method overloading in the next video as well, but I will just note that that's what we're doing here, is we're just overloading the constructor. Here it has 0 parameters, here it has a string, int parameter, and just like method signatures, those are different, so that's completely acceptable. All right. Now, what if we only want to set some default values and some real values? What are some things that we can do? Well, we can, have a constructor that takes in public, maybe just the information that we have. Maybe we have a title and a string author, but we don't actually yet have any, page count. I was like pointing at the page, but that doesn't do anything. You can't see me. So what is it that we can do here? Well, we could put title equals T and author equals A again, or we could call this constructor over here. How do we do that? Well, we're going to learn a new keyword, and the keyword is this. When we say this, we're talking about this object itself, its constructor. So it's like saying new book, only internally we would just say this. We could say this, T, A, 0 as the default value. And now over in main, if I wanted to make a new book, B5, new book. See, my book titles are very creative. And author, 5. This would still work because book 5 would create a new book and go to the constructor that has 2 strings. Well, that's right here. So no problem. It's going to come into here and it's going to call this object's constructor on string int. Well, it's going to find that right here. And inside here, it will take the string and int in that were passed through and set them to the instance variables. So we can chain our constructors together as a way to sort of both save from duplication and allow for this ability to mix default values and regular values. All right, now that we've seen the keyword this, I would like to add one more example in here of a constructor. We'll do one more color. Actually, I don't need a whole new color. I just need to change this constructor over here. Now, I named my parameters here, string T, string A, and string P. But what is very common, what you might actually see, is these might end up being named to match the name of the local instance variables as a way to just remember what is supposed to be aligned with what, because T, A, and P weren't particularly descriptive, right? So you might see something like this. But then we have a problem. And the problem is we cannot say title, or author is equal to author, pages are equal to pages. This won't work. This is ambiguous. Because while we know what we mean is the local title author pages need to be set to the instance title author pages, Java gets confused, and Java doesn't know what it is that you want to do here, and it's too ambiguous. It thinks you might want to be setting title to title, and this line does nothing. Or author and author, they both mean this one, it does nothing. Because Java is going to always try and find the closest variable it can first. It wants to be lazy, just like all of us. So when it sees title here, it says, you must mean this one, even though you didn't. And when it sees this one, it says, you must mean this one, even though you didn't. So what can you do? You can use this keyword. If we see this dot, and this dot, we're talking about this object. So not local title, this object's title. So now it knows that you actually want to use this title on this side, and then this one over here, it will find the closest title variable. It will find it right here. This author will find this object's instance of author, whereas this author right here is going to lazily find the closest locally scoped variable. And same with pages. So just another way that you could set up your constructors. It's just kind of worth noting. So basically what we see happening here is that a constructor gives us this instant setup. We're able to, in one line, easily put all of our data into an object and set it all up together rather than having to sort of manually go through each one. Now, in the next video, we're going to actually finally start talking about these access modifiers of public and private, what they mean, and how to use them so that we can hide our data a little bit better. All right, thanks for joining me on this discussion on object constructors, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks, bye.